Hello and welcome to Legal Thinking with me, Liam Pape, and my colleague Ed Wootton. Ed, how are you doing today?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad at all.
That's good to hear. I'm tip-top tickety-boo. No, I hear that first, actually. Let me redo that. I'm good, thank you, Ed. What do we discuss in today's podcast?
Well, today we are discussing innovation in social care. So following up from our Emerging from the Storm campaign that we did earlier this year that we'll link to in the show notes, we have brought on a couple of very knowledgeable guests. So we've got Sophie Chester-Glyn, who's Director of CoProduce Care, an organisation that supports those in care and their community to come together, and David Collins, who is a Data and Integrations Product Manager at Person-Centered Software. So two people who know a lot about, innovation in social care. We've also brought on our very own Mei-Ling Huang, who is a partner in our health and social care team.
Let's roll tape.
So yeah, thanks very much for joining us, David, Sophie and May. I guess the first question about innovation in the care sector is, how important it is. So what is the importance of innovation in the social care sector? Is it necessary? And if so, why?
I believe it's hugely important, but it has to go hand in hand with timeliness. So we as technologists and software vendors and all the hardware vendors and the likes can be very much on it when it comes to innovation and trying to be a couple of steps ahead as to what the sector needs. However, those who work in the sector have to be ready for this. So we could go and release something which was all singing, all dancing, using the latest AI and things like that. But the sector won't be ready, and we'll end up with something which actually may even set things back a couple of years because people will have been scared of the technology that came through. I believe that people within the sector have this, what I call DQ. So we all have an IQ and an EQ, and I think we have this digital version of that as to how ready we are and how mature we are towards accepting that.
Let's maybe move on to Sophie then.
It's a really good question. I feel like I want to roll back a little bit when I'm thinking about innovation and really understand, what do we mean by innovation? Because instantly when people say the word, in modern times, we think technology. But when we actually look at the definition of innovation, I had little ganders at the good old trusty Oxford Dictionary. And it mentions a new method, idea, or produce or product. And being innovative is thinking about new methods, and it uses the example of innovative designs or innovation, such as helping unemployed people get into work. So when I think about innovation, I like to think a lot about what we do every day, those small places close to home where we're doing things differently in our daily lives. And I think that social care actually is a hub of innovation. When you think, especially through the pandemic, thinking of how it had to it was on its own, the regulator wasn't going in, care staff were having, very little training, understanding of what COVID was at the time. And they just had to kickstart a way of working in a different way, of safety, of infection control. And I think that's where my idea of innovation really comes from. And in thinking about how important it is vital in terms of making sure that the people we look after are safe and are comfortable, and a great resource for ideas of innovation, both in terms of technology and working differently, is the Think Local Act Personal website. They have a directory of some incredible examples, something called a Compassionate Neighbours, where there's an organisation that sort of coordinates neighbours in a local area to work together to look after people who need support, and lots of ones like that. So I like to sort of think about the other ideas and concepts of innovation that are already going on and teasing those out as well. But it's vital to go forward, I think, with supporting people.
Yeah, and if anything, like you mentioned, the pandemic really showed the importance of innovation. And May, what are your thoughts on that?
I think Innovation's critical for the survival of the sector. I think we all have to move with the times, and you can't really pretend change isn't happening. And Sophie's example of the pandemic forcing changes, forcing innovation is a really good example of that. I think another example of that is the lack of staffing that we have at the moment. We've got 160,000 vacancies in the sector, and that lack of personnel is definitely going to force us to innovate and continue to force us to innovate. And we're seeing that in other countries who are ahead of us on that, like Japan and China, where the working age population is very low. And, frankly, somebody's got to take care of people. So there isn't really an alternative to innovation in one way, shape, or form. And part of the answer probably has to be money, and part of the answer has to be more people, but other parts of the answer probably lie in the realms of tech and our ways of thinking about the delivery of care. And as Sophie was alluding to, changing the way you think about what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. But the short answer in terms of why it's important is we have to do something. Because right now we've got this system under very significant pressure, and that, I think, will force us to change.
So in terms of the innovations that we're seeing now, a large part of the push is towards digitalizing social care. So in terms of tech, David, what are your predictions for the direction of travel over the next 5 years or 5 to 10 years? And have you got any predictions for 20 years' time, if you're going to be bold?
I probably wouldn't go so far to be bold. I mean, we saw a pandemic creep up on us quite quickly, so I'd try and avoid 20. But in the next 5 to 10, I think we can start to do some very clever stuff around where we take information from. So an example of this would be around, let's say, in a care home setting, or actually even a domiciliary setting. People want to be able to get to live with as much independence as they can. We need to be very, very aware that people are people, and we need to give them their space, time, and independence. Technology can help support that by providing feeds of data on their general well-being, on, say, for example, whether someone's had a fall or whether someone's moving around a location in a way in which is predictable and understandable. Whether they're taking their medications, say from a medications pot that can track whether or not it's been opened, taking all of that information and then further using it to understand individuals' needs and predict when something untoward may happen. Over the next 5 to 10 years, I can see us working more and more towards a predictive model and an intelligent model of care to help support individuals as least intrusively as possible. But it's going to take a lot of work to get there, and I think the push towards digitizing, with the ICSs starting to provide the funding to bring care homes in particular into the digital space, is really going to help, because you can only do that level of prediction and level of analysis once you have the absolute volume and velocity of data coming through into the data models to start then predicting what it is people need. And
obviously, like you said, Sophie, innovation isn't always about tech. Sometimes it's about just working more efficiently or trying to find a different way of doing things. You mentioned some, community support for staffing in the sector, but what innovations do you think need to be made in the sector in terms of staffing and staff training, particularly with the levels of vacancies that are in the sector at the moment? And have you heard any interesting developments that have already begun in this regard?
I think with technology and supporting staffing, it's really supporting them to do the work that they need to do on the ground. So almost taking away the monotony and the bind of paperwork, which takes people away from what they really originally came into care to do, which is to care for people. If you can help that part of someone's job, then you can help people in a physical sense do stuff that technology just cannot do. So at the moment, there's very popular the scheduling systems, EMR systems, And once people get their head around them, that there is a process of integrating that into people's work streams, which can be a bit challenging if people aren't used to it. But once they get there, from our experience, it usually is such a revolutionary change to people's working lives, and it does free them up with a little bit more time to spend with people on the ground. So those types of technology, and also with making care a little bit different, a little bit fun. So I've seen at various conferences people advertising virtual reality headsets for training. I think that could be something that would be very helpful, not only with costs in terms of training people, but also making it feel a lot more real and giving people that vision of how they would safely support somebody. And I read somewhere that King's College Hospital is currently taking part in a virtual reality pilot, and that's in order to help people with understanding people's mental health and diversity and inclusion training. So people are starting to adapt these type of ways of doing things differently. But I do wonder to what extent technology will potentially replace the need for staff. That's always I think the concern with people when they are embarking on new developments, because obviously staffing is a major challenge at the moment. So will certain technology do that?
And May, what do you think it will take to really get innovation going in the sector?
Well, I think it's obvious that there needs to be some money. And people talk a lot about money, so I won't focus on that too much. But there needs to, when any sector is undergoing change and new things are being developed, there needs to be some funding behind it. I think there needs to be a change in people's way of thinking. There has to be a focus on innovation and a focus on change. And when you have a problem to solve, you need to be able to stop and think about it. You need to be able to take what we call the helicopter view. So that means when you're down in the weeds, and Sophie alluded to the bind of paperwork, there's no way that you'll be able to get the big picture and think about doing things in a different way. So you need to get the headspace to be able to do that. And the trouble at the moment is that everybody's just trying to survive. So that's very difficult. I think we also need leadership, and we need the provision of the right environment. I recently attended, along with Dave, something called the Care Innovation Hub, which is being run now by the National Care Forum. So Vic Rayner and her colleagues at NCF. And the Care Innovation Hub brings together a lot of very bright people from the sector who want to facilitate change. So you've got providers, you've got managers, you've got carers, people who use services, people like Dave who work in the sector, and also groups of mostly university students, many of whom are postgrads in fields like tech and medical sciences and engineering. And they held a hackathon, which is an intensive weekend designed to enable people to develop new ideas very quickly and hopefully lead on to businesses that will foster change within the sector. So what's nice about this is it gives ideas a chance to blossom. And one of the top entries from a previous year attended to talk about how she has created a fully fledged business from her idea. So what she does is she provides a matching service for care providers and carers that enables care providers to find carers who are culturally aligned with and have the language skills that match up with those of their clients. And that was all born out of a hackathon a couple of years ago. And it shows how innovation can progress off the back of an idea when somebody takes the lead to create the right environment to nurture those ideas. So I think we need more headspace and more room for the development of the ideas.
Well, it sounds like there are green shoots of innovation coming through with things like the Care Innovation Hub and things like that. Obviously, when working day to day, care providers have to work, pretty closely with CQC guidelines. How does the relationship between regulation and new tech affect the progression of innovation in the sector? And that's a question for everyone, so whoever wants to jump in on that one first.
Can I just give an overview of that first? I think on the one hand, in my view anyway, on the one hand, regulation slows innovation down, but on the other hand, it speeds it up. So regulation slows innovation down because the regulator is fundamentally risk averse. And around 5 years ago, CQC were talking about doing something called regulatory sandboxing, which means that they would allow innovations to be tested in a safe, controlled, regulated environment. So they talked a good game, but I haven't seen any of that happen personally. Maybe it's happening and I just haven't seen it. I haven't heard anything further about that. And I think that CQC's aversion to risk makes it harder for providers to take chances, and you need to take chances to innovate. I think there is a way for CQC to speed things up. They are actively behind in supporting the digitalization of care records and things like that, at least in principle. And the way they're approaching things now supports that. They are using the information that they obtain about a service as the basis for going in to inspect. They then look to see if you've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's in terms of particular aspects of care and record keeping. And they are taking a really quite microscopic view, I think. So that makes it important to have every I dotted. And care providers basically have to have the electronic care systems to be able to cope with that kind of scrutiny. And those electronic care systems also help with auditing, which is required to a much higher standard these days by CQC. I think the problem is this all still falls down in places. There are a lot of different systems out there, and two things happen with some frequency. One is that the inspector doesn't actually understand how to use your system, and they misinterpret the data, or they can't find the data, and they come to the wrong conclusion about it. And the second problem that often occurs is when a service is transitioning into a new system, and it's not complete yet, or it's bedding in, then that affects the quality of what CQC view and can lead to criticisms by them. So I would say that CQC's regulation of the sector is pushing towards digitalization, but otherwise their risk aversion probably slows things down in terms of innovation. And CQC is not an organization that's designed to be creative, but then again, most bureaucracies are not. Most regulators are not.
And linking back to Sophie's point earlier about innovation can come in the form of small changes, we've noticed that our customers using our system will have gone through a regulatory inspection as normal, but as a result of that, there will be some feedback saying, how do I find this information out? Normally we use the systems day to day. How do I get to that? And we're then able to make small innovations to provide more contextual-based information within the reports. So say, for example, someone's independent and you're looking at a hygiene chart, and the CQC inspect the hygiene chart and say, why has Mr. Smith not had a bath? Well, actually, he has. He does it himself. He's more than capable. But recording that information was key, and that was an innovation change that helped us grow the system and helps us then further support the customers as feedback from the regulator.
That's really interesting, actually. I love these type of innovations and to show how things can be different in care provision. But I was really interested with Mei's comments, actually, because I, rightly or wrongly, have seen it quite different with the CQC. I've kind of noticed maybe they haven't embedded it into their general inspection framework properly, to be fair, but I've definitely noticed that they seem to be talking about innovation a lot more, like they want to see more, and in their reports they are very much in favour of people who are doing things differently. I definitely think it is very difficult to explain, and from on the ground I found people have found it difficult to sometimes get inspectors to understand how their tech or innovation is making a difference. But I think maybe it's a case of providers even having a innovation policy that sets out really clearly, this is what we are doing and this is the impact to the people that we support or to our staff, and this is the positive difference it's making. And then along with that, having some feedback. So any innovation that people put through, I definitely feel it's a benefit if you can go back and do a Survey Monkey and get people, or just a questionnaire that people fill out and say, what do you think of us using emails? We did this with Teams, or electronic medication monitoring. We did this with Microsoft Teams. We actually started trialing it back in 2018, and we found it very difficult to even get our local authority to have interest in what we're doing. Fast forward 2020, everyone's trying to jump on Microsoft Teams and using it, but by that time it's embedded within our organization. So it's helpful for us because we've got home care, we've got residential, we've got lots of different types of sort of services, not particularly large, but it really helps as a communication tool. Some of the teams are using it as their communication record. We've been able to communicate really quickly to find people who have gone missing, and that's really helped the team work quicker and faster. And I think it's just using those type of examples and embedding that in the the PIR or the feedback to CQC to really help them understand the impact it's having on people that are being supported. I think that might be the change that hopefully makes the culture of CQC kind of see how what you're doing and how you're using new innovation is beneficial to your services.
We noticed that actually. So through building the system and getting our system into care providers over a course of time, with the CQC reports being freely available, we were able to search for any references to this, and we noticed over a period of time it really started to pick up. And obviously individual inspectors will have their own personal opinions around a system being used, but on the whole we've noticed that over time the fact that they were seeing systems like ours in place has really helped the regulators get more on board with this shift to digital and understand and appreciate that actually it's there to support the workers, to deliver the best care they can, but also make the managers' lives easier, and then onwardly make the regulators' lives easier in inspecting.
Yeah, okay, so I guess I'll just run on to the last question, which is, if you had the power, what would be on your wish list to help the sector move into a better future?
How long have you got? Sticking with the innovation theme, I'm just speaking from experience. When we tried to put new innovation in, we found it very difficult to just say to managers, right, this is what we need to do, go ahead and bring your teams along. What we were really lucky to have at the time, because we had the resources, we had somebody in the organisation whose sole raison d'etre, if you like, was to help with technology, whether it was the local laptop or it was with using Microsoft Teams or any other technology we were using. And that really did lessen the pressure for managers to do everything they're doing on the ground, plus trying to embed new innovation on the ground. So I think if there could be some kind of support which providers and managers can draw from, that's either commissioned centrally or by local authorities, that everybody can draw from, that one person who can come on site and support them with embedding innovation, or even a pot of ring-fenced funds that providers can go and use that to pilot their own new tech or their own way of working, whether it's with the community in a different way, because that's all part of innovation as well, and that they can use that, whether it's grant funding, so that can be personalised for the organisation. Because one thing we haven't touched on is the fact that social care is so nuanced. So what might work in a care home won't necessarily work in home care, which might not work for people who are employing their own personal assistants. So having something that people can use and adapt for their own and personalise to their own services for innovation, I think would really help from my point of view.
I'd actually echo that as well. There's a barrier to digital adoption, and that barrier is time, fear, and mostly it really. And people need support. People need the support in understanding that it can be difficult, but it's not it's not an unclimbable mountain, and having that support would be key. We try and provide as much support as possible and as much structure in demonstrating the journey to going digital. But as a provider, there's only so much that we can do. Having that more on the ground support from peers and groups who have gone through that change already would be absolutely fantastic, and completely echo Sophie. Having that central resource to call off to get that support would be absolutely ideal.
I'd like to zoom out a little bit about this question. I think that one of the most important things we need is a change in mindset of the people who have the power to resource the system, and specifically the people who have the power to make policy. So we've got a lot of 40, 50, 60-year-old MPs in Parliament who need to think, this is going to be me someday. How will I want to be cared for? We all are going to need support to one degree or another, but I think many people don't seem to think it will affect them. And that idea that this is important for all of us needs to be internalized. And our politicians need to be brave enough to put all of this above political point scoring and stop kicking the issues into the long grass. I think we are starting to see a shift in the recognition that the NHS is dependent on the adequate provision of social care to function properly, and that is the beginning of a first step. But now we need to see the follow-through in terms of the provision of funding, the enablement of the sector to recruit enough staff, to train the staff, to bring social care into the world of respected and recognized professions like doctors and nurses. And, I think we need to applaud everybody in the sector, all those leaders who've been trying to make the people in government see this stuff and recognize what needs to be done. And it feels like a long, hard slog in that respect. But we're starting to detect a bit of change, at least in terms of the recognition of the problems, if not in terms of the solutions and the funding that's required to achieve the solutions. I'd also like to see a regulatory framework that really recognizes the value of innovation in the sector. And, we maybe sort of slightly disagree about that, but I think it is to some degree recognized through the award of outstanding ratings and digitalization. But right now, CQC is almost fully focused on the rooting out of risk as opposed to the recognition of good practice and innovation. So I think they need to get fully behind the innovation push and recognize that it's not just about digitalization. And I would say the same for local authority and NHS commissioners. Everybody's just trying to survive. And I think we need to try to look beyond that. And then lastly, I think we probably need more incubator type facilities, enterprises like the Care Innovation Hub. We need more conversations about innovation and the space to do that in, and more support for the development of ideas that come from both inside and outside the sector. So that's the big picture view anyway. I think, Sophie's right that lots of people are doing innovation on an everyday sort of level, but we need to have those bigger conversations to share those ideas and spread those things across the sector.
Great. Sophie, David and May, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Legal Thinking. As Ed mentioned in the prelude to this podcast, to find out more about this topic, you can find our Emerging from the Storm report on the RWK Goodman website. Just give that a Google. Or Ed, do you have the URL to hand?
I have it to hand. It will be /Emerging Storm, but there's also a link in the show notes.
That makes things a lot easier.
Indeed it does.
As always, if you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to leave us a 5-star review on your podcast provider of choice. That really does help other people find us and move us up the ranks. And as always, you can listen to us on YouTube or whatever else you may want to listen to podcasts.
Make sure to do that.
Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.